Mexico open election. And we are recording this just to let you guys know. I'm a former New Mexico State rep, former U.S. diplomat, former serial entrepreneur, and an avid elections reform and democracy reform activist. I'm a volunteer with New Mexico Open Elections. So I want to give you about a 3-minute overview about why we have so many active volunteers in New Mexico Open Elections and what we're about. I think, I think most New Mexicans and most Americans know that there's something wrong with our political system. But most of us are just way too busy to kind of sort through what the problems are. And so I want to lay out in about 3 minutes what most of us at New Mexico Open Elections think some of the issues are. So in a nutshell, number one, no one out there seems to be listening. Politicians come from safe districts with little competition. They worry mostly about getting past their next primary. They tend to only listen to the party base, especially in a closed primary state like New Mexico. And that's a huge problem because as a former elected official, I tried to listen to everybody, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, Libertarians, Greens, and that's happening less and less and less because of the polarization. And we can talk about what's really led to that. Number two, no one is really compromising in problem solving in most state legislatures and certainly in Congress. And if you guys can mute, make sure you're on mute because we're not going to try to control you too much, but make sure you're on mute. Nowadays, if elected officials work with somebody across the aisle, also known as the enemy camp, unfortunately, they're primaried by somebody more extreme. The Democrats tend to be primaried by somebody further left. Republicans tend to be primaried by somebody further right. Under our current system, there's really no reward for working together. That's a huge problem. And number three, no one's very civil anymore. It seems like I'll show my age, in the 70s and 80s, there was at least bipartisan dialogue. Nowadays, negative campaigning is recognized as one of the leading voter suppression tools. I know I want to pull my hair out, and you can see that I already did. After 6 to 8 weeks of awful negative campaigning, every 5 minutes on the air, it just is tiring, and people tune out. So the question is what are the solutions? We're going to talk about some of the solutions today with some great guest speakers, but there really are practical solutions that some states have already passed, that New Mexico is trying to pass. So number one, we can make politicians listen by making all elections more competitive. We can do that through open primaries, through ranked choice voting, through the creation of competitive districts through independent redistricting commissions, and easier ballot access for independent and minor party candidates. These are all initiatives that other states have passed, and again, we're working on in New Mexico. We can incentivize coalition building and problem solving by adopting some of these reforms I just mentioned. Because if all voters can vote for all candidates all the time, then all candidates have to listen to all voters all the time. And that's not really happening in the current polarized atmosphere of closed primaries. Mostly candidates in most districts are listening to the party base. And then the last thing I'll mention, which is a good segue to ranked choice voting, is that we can reward civility in politics by allowing voters to choose not just their first choice of candidate, but their second choice and their third choice, because that's called ranked choice voting. And there's a lot of good political science data to show that if the candidates know that even if maybe they're not your first choice, they want to be your second choice, and they're not going to badmouth the opponent and turn off those supporters if they're also trying to become your second choice or third choice, maybe out of 5 or 6 or 7 candidates. So we'll talk more about ranked choice voting today and open primaries in the future town halls that Scylla is organizing. But I would like to now introduce Scylla Avcel. She's our first full-time executive director and has really helped transform the work that we've been doing over the last year. Scylla?
Hello, everyone. Let me pin myself. Hello, my name is Scylla. as Bob mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of New Mexico Open Elections. And as you can see, we are joined by two amazing women across the nation today to help us kind of go through the steps and the implementation processes of ranked choice voting and open primaries in Alaska and opportunities for New Mexico as well. So without further ado, I will start my introductions. So here today we are joined by Julie Lucky and Maria Perez. So Julie started with Alaskans for Better Elections in 2022 and has spent the last year educating voters on the Alaska election system and ranked choice voting. For the previous 26 years, she worked as a legislative aide for the Alaska State Legislature, where she specialized in staffing standing committees and serving as a procedural expert for conference committees. A nonpartisan who worked for legislators from both parties, Julie was known for negotiating compromise legislation on diverse topics, including oil taxes, education funding, fisheries issues, and COVID-19 economic hardship relief. Julie lives in Anchorage, Alaska, with her 2 children, 2 dogs, and a revolving door of rescue puppies. And Maria Perez was born and raised in Ecuador and immigrated to the United States in the 1990s to pursue her education. A seasoned nonprofit leader, organizer, facilitator, advocate, educator, and coalition builder, Maria is a firm believer in the power of people coming together to address complex social problems. She spent over 10 years as a healthcare practitioner before turning to policy, equity, and advocacy work. She served as campaign lead and later as interim hub manager for the California Endowments Project, Building Health Communities in East Oakland. And she was also the director of Fair Vote New Mexico and a campaign manager for Common Cause New Mexico. She's a national expert on the issue of ranked choice voting. She believes that democracy is the ultimate health equity indicator and devotes her professional work to ensure that the democratic process is accessible to all people. And before I turn it over to these amazing speakers, I do want to let you guys know during the presentations and discussions, we won't be taking active questions. So please save your questions for the end. We will have a Q&A. And you can also type them in the chat and I can read them later once we get to that point.
That's fine.
But in the meantime, if you guys could please keep yourselves muted, that would be great. And I will turn it over to Julie and Maria.
All right. And I think, Maria, did you want me to go first? All right. So in Alaska in 2020, we passed ballot measure 2, which implemented, among other things, nonpartisan open primaries and ranked choice voting general elections. And so when we started last year, we expected to have a nonpartisan open primary in August, followed by a November ranked choice voting election. We had 10 months to get everybody ready. And then we had the unfortunate death and a special election, which meant that we had a June statewide special primary before our districts were redrawn by redistricting, which was our first ever statewide mail-in election. That drew 48 candidates. Our longstanding representative had been in office for almost 50 years. And so it was the first time the seat had been open in a very long time. We then had a combination. Our first ranked choice voting was actually on the combination ballot with our regularly scheduled primary. And when I say it was on the same ballot, I mean actually on the same piece of paper. So our electorate had to navigate that first ranked choice vote along with open primaries for 59 of our legislative seats, as well as 3 statewide offices. And then we had our regularly scheduled general election in November. So one of the reasons I bring this up is because we had a very compressed timeline. We had a very confusing process where you had ranked choice voting with the same candidates for the same office. On the other side, where you had the primary for the office that was starting in January, we had one special election and then one January election for that same seat with the same candidates. So the good news is, despite these challenges, we had a very, very small error rate. 99.8% of our ballots were valid ballots filled out correctly. The majority of people ranked more than one candidate. So depending on what race you looked at, we were looking at 73%, I think, in the first race for the special election where there was only one race, and 2/3 was the average for the other statewide races in November. In addition, we did some exit polling and found that 85% of people thought that ranked choice voting was simple in that first election. And remember, I'm talking about an election that had 2 races on one ballot. And majority of people, over 90% of people, felt that they had gotten some education before they went into the polls. So the great thing is, I think Alaskans are great, but I also think that if we can do it with all of those challenges, then, you know, when people say it's confusing, it's a few more steps. But I will say, if we can do it with all those challenges, then you guys can do it on a regular election year in whatever election you're looking at. And yes, it's a couple more steps, but it's not so confusing that voters didn't get it. So what I'll say is Alaska has a very long history. I think that we, in some ways, were a poster child for this particular reform, where you have the open primary leading to, we call it the top five. For us, it's 4 candidates, right? Alaska always has a write-in option. So we do have 5 slots. It's just one of them's a write-in slot at the end of the day. We've had open primaries more than we haven't. So we had open primaries up until the year 2000. They were a little bit different in the sense that it was still a partisan primary. So everybody got the same ballot. Everybody could vote for whomever they wanted to, but the top vote getter in each party went on. Whereas the reform we have now allows the top 4 most competitive candidates to move on. But that's kind of been the Alaskan way for a long time. We just saw the party rule close primaries starting in the year 2000 for us. And ranked choice voting, it works really well for our constituency, and I think it works well for any constituency. But for Alaska, we've had a lot of independent candidates. A lot of you might know that we did have a Senate race that was won by a write-in when the primary election results weren't what the regular electorate wanted. So we've seen a lot of kind of, you know, people that didn't come out of the primary win in various races. We've had a lot of close races. We've had a coin toss, you know, in the last 20 years. So Alaska has a lot of competition at elections, and I think the reform fit us very well. Roughly 60% of Alaskan voters are unaffiliated with a major party. And so we have the majority of our voters are not voting, or we were allowed, nonpartisan undeclareds were allowed to vote in the primaries, but the parties could choose to let you in or not. So they habitually had let the nonpartisan undeclareds vote, but it wasn't guaranteed open by any means. So, and I'm sorry, I'm talking fast because I know we have limited time, but I'm sure somebody will tell me if I'm talking too fast. I tend to be a bit of a fast talker anyway. So what did we see happen in 2022, which was our kind of trial run for this system? We saw that the nonpartisan primary, open primary, reduced barriers to entry. So we saw a lot more competition, not only in that 48 candidates for Don Young seat, but we saw more underrepresented candidates at a lot of different levels. We saw more women running. We saw a more diverse candidate pool, not only when you look at racial demographics, but also political demographics, right? So we're more variance within the parties in each of these races. And then as far as results go, we did see more competition at that general. And that's, I think, one of the things I really like about this system is, while we've had the open primary in Alaska before, having those 4 top candidates move on, or 5 would be 5, I think, depending on what system you're looking at, to that general election where you have higher turnout. We have, and I'm sure that you have in your state, I don't know exactly how your districts come out, but we have a few of our districts are habitually blowouts, right? It's generally whoever wins the primary takes the seat. So I will say one of the districts that we have has been a conservative district for a very long time. I just happen to know who was in that seat because it's remained fairly static. For the last 20 years, the closest race they had was 29 points. The average was 46 points. So when you get down to that general election where you've got a lot more voters participating, there were blowouts pretty much for the last 20 years. This year, 5-point difference. So they had 2 Republicans move on to that general election, and they had a competitive race where the people in that general election got to actually choose, well, I would be happy with either of these candidates. And that competitive, like I said, within 5 points. So it was very exciting to see this kind of competition happen all over the state, where even in my own neighborhood, it's always been decided at the primary. And so I was very excited to have 2 actually competitive candidates to choose from. And generally that's what we've seen, is 2 or 3 competitive candidates. And while the system allows for more to move on, it seems like you have a couple, a couple from that are closely aligned, and then maybe one which would be considered a spoiler candidate in a previous election. What we saw in Alaska in the 3 districts where the ranked choice voting kind of kicked in, where you had that 2 politically aligned candidates and then one who might have been a spoiler, we saw that system really work, where the person that eventually won was the same party as the candidate that was first eliminated and was very closely aligned with them. So we were very excited with how the elections went in Alaska. We felt that when it came to ranked choice voting and when candidates were eliminated, you were seeing that system work to elect somebody that aligned with a majority of the district and remove that spoiler effect. We saw more diverse candidates in that primary. We saw more competition at that general election. And I will highlight, there were two cases where we had one senator who had actually been taken out in a closed primary in the previous election that actually came back and ran again. This is a woman who had won with majority vote over the last 5 elections. She had, with redistricting, she had actually had to run every single election, had a majority support, was taken out in that primary. She made some choices that the party wasn't happy with, got taken out in that closed primary, came back in 2022 and won handily in that district. And so what we saw was the candidate that the people wanted to choose was kind of taken away from them in that closed primary process. And when that primary process is opened back up, that is the candidate they eventually chose. And she might not have been available as a candidate to them in that closed primary. And that's what we saw happen with her race in 2020. There was another race in a fairly conservative district where the woman had been in the House and was running for a Senate seat. I don't know how much you know about Alaska politics, but we had a House that we've in 2020, our House is 40 members. So they were 2020 with organization. They couldn't get to a majority, neither party. So for a third of the session, for a month in the session, our session's technically 3 or 4 months long, depending on if you go with a constitutional or statutory limit. But generally, I mean, so either a third or a quarter, depending on how you look at it, the House couldn't do any business, which also meant the Senate couldn't do any business because you can't pass anything over. We can't have joint sessions. None of that can happen. So we had one of the representatives basically cross over to the other side and said, you know, the state, this is not good for the state. We're just sitting here arguing over the same things for 30 days. We're not doing the state's business. Because she joined with members of the other party, she was censured by her party. And they said, basically, we take you out in the primary, you're censured, we're going to run a recall. And she handily won her district in 2022. And that just goes to show that, you know, this is kind of how the system works to kind of reward that you make the tough choices that are best for your district, and your district gets to choose whether or not they're going to support you, as opposed to you being not offered as a candidate because the primary took you out, right? And so that's kind of what we saw. I mean, obviously, I'm an advocate for the system. I like how the system went. I think that everybody thinks that competition is good for democracy. That's what I feel like we saw in Alaska. A lot of the fears that people had did not come through when we saw ranked choice. Ranked choice voting did not kick in the majority of our, as far as someone coming from behind and winning. It didn't kick in most of our races. Most of our races, the person who was in first stayed in first and went all the way through, but they ended up with a majority vote. But where we did see that happen, it was basically where you would have had a spoiler effect in any previous election. And so we really like how this came out. The Senate organized with a 17-member coalition. So both parties coming together and organizing, and the House, while they did go with a party majority, the freshmen all came together and started a freshman bipartisan caucus so that they could keep those lines of communication open. So those are kind of the results we're seeing in Alaska, and I think Maria can talk more about how the process would work in your state.
Awesome. Thank you, Julie. Thank you for sharing your experience. So I don't think you mentioned this, but Julie leads Alaskans for Better Elections. You did mention that, but Alaskans for Better Elections did a lot of work with voter education, like really doing amazing outreach. Alaska is huge. It's sort of like a frontier state, right? There's a lot of really remote communities, and Julie's organization did a fantastic job, and it showed, right? So thank you, Julie, for all you do. And very good to be here today. I'm really happy to see some of the names on the screen. Hi, everyone. My name is Maria Perez. I'm a co-director of an organization called Democracy Rising. I'm based in Santa Fe, here in New Mexico, but my organization is not a New Mexico-based organization. We do work at the national level. We work, for example, with Julie and Alaskans for Better Elections for the past couple of years, and We've done work around the country. We do a lot of voter and candidate education in jurisdictions that have passed ranked choice voting. We don't advocate for it, but we do a lot of education work. So that's sort of like my orientation around this. I'm gonna ask Sila to show you all a little short video that my organization produced about ranked choice voting, just to sort of like level set, and then we'll come back and talk a little more.
Problem is, communities across the country feel like their elected officials don't have their best interests at heart. Voters may feel like their vote doesn't matter, or worse, they're disillusioned because our elected officials don't actually represent us. But guess what? Changing the way we elect our public officials can be a game changer. When you make the rules of the game more fair, you get better results. This game changer is known as ranked choice voting. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're skeptical, but fear not. In this video, we'll explain what ranked choice voting is and how it can help voters feel better represented by their elected officials. So, what exactly is ranked choice voting? With RCV, instead of selecting just one candidate, you rank your candidates in order of preference. We rank things all the time in our everyday lives, and using this process in elections would be no different. When we are selecting one winner, ranked choice voting ensures the winner has majority support. To start, we only look at the voters' first choices. If a candidate already has a majority, then that candidate wins. But if no candidate receives a majority, the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated. And voters who ranked that candidate as their first choice have their vote instantly go to their second choice. To help us visualize what ranked choice voting is and how it works, let's visit Mr. Perez's classroom. His students are excited for a pizza party, but how do they figure out what type of pizza to order that will please the majority of the group?
Okay, kids, we can only get one kind of pizza for the class today. What kind should we get?
Cheese only. Pepperoni. Ham and pineapple?
Wow, those are all great choices. Let's take a vote by ranking our choices in order of preference.
Ranking your vote is as easy as 1, 2, 3. You simply indicate your first choice, the candidate you love, your second choice, the candidate you like, and so on. Since we're only choosing one kind of pizza today, we want to make sure as many students as possible have a say. The students have cast their ballots. Let's find out what's happened. At first, none of the pizzas had a majority, so we eliminated the candidate with the fewest votes, Hawaiian. After eliminating it, sorry pineapple on pizza lovers, the students who had Hawaiian as their first choice overwhelmingly supported cheese pizza as their second. So cheese pizza becomes the clear winner with over 68% of support from the entire class. Ranked choice voting is like this classroom's pizza party. It allows you to vote your conscience without having to worry about wasting your vote or losing your voice, giving voters more choice and more power. Ranked choice voting has been tried and tested. Grassroots-led initiatives to introduce RCV have popped up all across the country. We know this process works, and we know it can benefit voters and the community at large. No matter how you slice it, ranked choice voting is a reform that makes sense. To learn more, visit www.wearedemocracyrising.org.
All right, thank you, Sila. So I hope that was a little helpful if you're not super familiar with ranked choice voting and how it works. So I want to spend a couple minutes talking about ranked choice voting in New Mexico. I see that Rick Lass is here, old school advocate for ranked choice voting in our state. This is a conversation that's been going on in our state for a while. There's been advocates for ranked choice voting for a while, but it didn't really become a reality in New Mexico until 2018. So in 2008, in the city of Santa Fe, my hometown, there was a question on the ballot that year, 2008, that asked, among some other questions, asked the voters if they would like to have ranked choice voting elections instead of the plurality elections we had up to that point. And plurality, for those of you who are not familiar with that term, just means that the candidate with the votes wins, regardless of whether that's a majority, right? So we have two candidates. One of them is by default going to get a majority, but if there's a field of 3, 4, 5 candidates somebody could easily win with way less than a majority, right? Somebody could get elected with 30% of the vote. That means that 70% of the people actually preferred a different candidate. 2008, the voters of Santa Fe were asked on a ballot question if they wanted to move to ranked choice voting or keep that system that was in place up to that point. Overwhelming majority, about 65% of the voters in Santa Fe voted to change to ranked choice voting in 2008. Fast forward 10 years, 2018, ranked choice voting hadn't been implemented yet, even though the voters had voted for it. And there was some vague language in that charter amendment that the voters approved that said, City of Santa Fe shall have ranked choice voting when the voting machines are capable of tabulating this in an acceptable manner and at a reasonable cost, right? So like both of these things are a little bit vague. Like, what is tabulating in an acceptable manner? What is a reasonable cost? So the city had just basically decided that they could kick the can down the road for 10 years, at which point I got a job as director of Fair Vote New Mexico, and my task was to really try to get the city to actually follow its own laws and implement ranked choice voting. At that time, also, our Secretary of State, Maggie Toulouse Oliver, did an update to the voting software for our state. So New Mexico has, all of our counties use the same voting machines, and they all have like the same software updates that are done, with some regularity. So in 2017, there was this upgrade to our voting machines, and that software upgrade included ranked choice voting tabulation, like state-of-the-art ranked choice voting tabulation that all the machines around the state have. And then the Secretary of State's office paid for that upgrade, right? So like these two issues that had been sticking points in Santa Fe were cleared up. The machines were there, they could tabulate, and it was at no cost to the city because the Secretary of State's office had paid for this. So this was 2017. I was talking to city council and the mayor at that time, organizing a group of advocates, some of them who had, advocated for this 10 years prior when that ballot question was posed to the voters. And the city just twice decided to just keep kicking the can, right? Like, and their reasoning was that it would be too hard, that it would be really a burden on the city clerk, and that might have been true, but it's still the law of the city and it still needed to be followed. So that the city voted twice to just not implement ranked choice voting. Like, they'll do it later, but for now, let's not do it. There was a mayoral election coming up. It's gonna be too hard. At that point, myself with a handful of other Santa Fe voters filed a lawsuit against the city of Santa Fe, saying that they had to follow the law that it's in the charter. The charter says the city shall implement ranked choice voting. The time is now, and we actually won that case. So in 2018, the city was mandated by a judge's order to implement ranked choice voting for that mayoral election. So we had about 8 weeks from that ruling to the election day. So it was like 8 weeks to really educate the voters and the candidates on ranked choice voting. And it was challenging, to say the least, but we had a plan in place ready to kick off in case we got that ruling, right? So like, we were prepared. We had generous funding to do this, and once we won the case, the city got right on board, right? The public information officer at the time said, okay, this issue has been legally decided. Let's work together. Let's make sure that voters know what's going on. And we did a great job educating the voters. Hold on a second. I have some dog issues. I'll be right.
You're all good, Maria. I'm sure we all know how that goes sometimes.
They are all so quiet except for when you have to be on camera. You know what I mean? They sleep all day except for when you're working. Okay, so fast forward, election day happened. Like I said, we had an open seat for mayor that year. We had 5 candidates running for mayor that year. And when it came down to it, the voters of Santa Fe, about 65% of the voters ranked more than 3 candidates on their ballot. You know, that shows you that people understood what their task was, right? Like rank the candidates you like on your ballot, and people did that. The candidate that came in first after the first round was at, 32% of the vote, I think. And then after 4 rounds of the elimination and reallocation of votes, the candidate won that mayoral seat with 66% of the vote. So like Julie said, right, this person was already coming as a front runner, but when it was all said and done, he won with a large mandate, 66%. If you come into an office with 66% of the vote, you come in with a mandate. And the mayor was clear that he wouldn't have gotten that kind of a mandate if he hadn't gotten those second and third choice votes from other people in the field, right? Other candidates, voters in the field. So that was a successful election. 70%, we did an exit poll. 70% of the voters said that they wanted to keep using ranked choice voting. And I think it was like close to 90% of the voters were either felt that it was very easy or fairly easy to interact with their ballot. So that was a good positive experience in Santa Fe. And then shortly after that, our state legislature, the following year, passed like an election bill that got cleaned up in 2019 a little further, and that's what we know as the Local Election Act. It's a big bill. It has a lot of stuff in it, but one of the things that it has is that it allows for any municipality in New Mexico to opt into ranked choice voting. So as soon as that bill was passed, the city of Las Cruces, the council voted to adopt ranked choice voting, and their next election at the municipal level was a ranked choice voting election as well, and it went quite well. They had 10 candidates for mayor that year, and people ranked their ballot, and it went fairly well in Las Cruces as well. One thing I will say about sort of like what you can see, right, with the ranked choice voting election after a couple of cycles, what kind of effects do you see in governing bodies? And I have to say that both in Las Cruces and in Santa Fe, we have seen more women being elected. Las Cruces right now has an all-women city council, which is unbelievable, right? And also the other thing that is seems really important to me is that the median age of those governing bodies dropped by probably like 15 or 20 years. So younger people are running, younger people are viable candidates and are able to win elections. So what I've learned, I've been doing some work in the past several months, just exploring municipalities in New Mexico, seeing if, like people might be interested in learning more about ranked choice voting, might be interested in perhaps adopting ranked choice voting for their municipal elections. And what became really apparent quickly is that most people are not even aware that there's this local option for jurisdictions in New Mexico. So this, if you take anything away from what I'm talking about today, is that New Mexico has a local option bill, and your city can have ranked choice voting. If you wanted it, you could advocate for it. There's no legal barrier. There's no, the only barrier there would be the political will, right, to get it done. But it is available to every jurisdiction in New Mexico, any nonpartisan election, basically. So school boards, could go to ranked choice voting. It's there, it's an option. And the other thing I will say about having a local option, like at the municipal level like this, is the state of Utah. State of Utah is interesting because a few years back, one of the most conservative members of their House of Representatives and one of the most progressive members of the House of Representatives came together and introduced a bill to have a local option for ranked choice voting. So that was like a really interesting bipartisan sort of push. And it took a little minute, but eventually the state of Utah did pass. It's a pilot project, I suppose. It's slated to last for 10 years, I believe. But as soon as it was passed, this local option bill, the next election cycle, there was 23 cities in Utah that chose to implement ranked choice voting. Salt Lake City being the big one, but there's these like tiny little cities, townships, right, in Utah that chose to adopt ranked choice voting. It was implemented last year, and we did a lot of voter education, a lot of candidate education there, and it worked perfectly, right? And the interesting thing, both about Alaska and about the Utah experiment around this, is that it really demystified ranked choice voting for the voters. Like, it's intuitive. People know how to use their ballot. It's not that hard as opponents would like you to think. But also that, you know, these are states that have very conservative areas. They're states that have progressive pockets and a lot of independent voters, right? So in both in Alaska and in Utah, you see that the system worked as intended. So in more conservative areas, voters were able to elect a more conservative candidate. In more progressive areas, voters were able to elect a more progressive candidate, and independents were able to participate, right? And in sort of like purple areas, they elected a more moderate candidate. So it's voter-centric. It's what it's supposed to be. The parties are not dictating who wins. It's not about the candidates, it's about the voters. So I'll stop there and we can open it up to some Q&A. But if you are interested in having ranked choice voting in your city, there's some Albuquerque people here. That's an opportunity. Let's talk.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, Julie, so much. I already see one hand raised, so I'm just going to go ahead and call on this person. Kimmy, please go ahead and unmute yourself to ask your question.
Hi, my name's Kimmy Cole. I'm from Carson City, Nevada, and I was part of a big effort in Nevada to pass a ballot initiative to implement ranked choice voting. Now we have to pass it again in 2024 to turn it into law. But one of the questions for whoever wants to field it, you know, we're looking at educating the public, familiarizing them even better with ranked choice voting. And a lot of the time we'll have conversations, and once people understand it, they say, hey, that's great. That's easy enough to do. And then we have institutional entities against us saying, you don't want to do this. It's confusing. Stay away from it. My question would be, did you have any particular outreach education that really stood out, like this really resonated, it brought people in? Could you identify any such response to anything that you did that you felt was noticeably more effective than others?
I'm happy to take that, Julie, and if you have something at the end to add, that'd be great. So, like I mentioned, my organization, we've done voter education about ranked choice voting all over the country, from like tiny jurisdictions to like helping big jurisdictions like the state of Alaska, right? Like develop their voter education plan. The most effective way to educate voters about ranked choice voting is to give them a sample ballot with fake candidates. Please don't include actual names of actual people or candidates on the ballot, because that can be a really charged issue if you put the real candidates on the ballot. And more importantly, if you have the real names of the real candidates on a mock ballot and you have people fill it out, some voters are going to believe that they voted, right? So like, you want to stay away from that. But the most effective way to educate voters about ranked choice voting is to give them a mock ballot. You can use foods, you can use favorite national park, you can use favorite beer, right? Run a mock election if you can. If you can't have a whole mock election, just give voters a mock ballot, tell them to fill it out. And that's all you need to do. Once people, it's a very kinetic experience and a very intuitive experience. People know how to rank stuff. If they get a mock ballot, they'll be like, oh, I really like chocolate cake the best, but if they don't have chocolate cake, I'll choose the Danish or whatever it is. People get it. It's easy. And once you have them fill that out, you say, by the way, this is what ranked choice voting is. You do exactly the same thing, but with candidates. There's rarely a follow-up question about that. Julie, do you have something to add to that?
And I'll echo what Maria said, and I'll say that our most effective mock elections were mock elections that did something that the people were interested in. And the other second, like the highest return we got was we had an M&M election that I think got some national press, but we also did Sour Patch Kids, which if you guys have ever seen them, they come in a little small container with 5 Sour Patch Kids. And we did the Reading Rendezvous, which is a summer reading program for kids, and 5-year-olds could fill out the ballot. Like we had little posters for the campaigns for lemon and raspberry or whatever the flavors were. And it was amazing because when the kids can fill it out and the parents see the kids fill it out, it's really hard for them to say that it was incredibly confusing. Because I mean, my daughter's 14. She was teaching 3 to 10 5-year-olds at a time how to rank and these Sour Patch Kids. And it's nice because they come in a little candidate, I always say this is candidate debate. Not all the candidates show up. Sometimes that happens. But the kids get to have Sour Patch Kids. The parents learn how to do it. You give them a little ballot to take home. Everybody has a good time. And so I think that that's, what Maria's saying is like, you have a good time with it. And then, oh, you just voted. And that was ranked choice voting. And I had people that really had been told by people, this is very confusing. You're never going to get it. And I just said, hey, so if you were going to vote for a person, let's say blue's your favorite, how would you do it? And intuitively, they knew how to do it. And so I think that letting people come to that conclusion that it's easy by just getting it right the first time was also really helpful. But we did and that's what the note I have is mock elections everywhere. Book club, mock election, right? Sour Patch Kids, anything that you have to choose, you can rank choice vote.
I love that. Thank you both.
Is that the least effective way to educate voters about ranked choice voting is just to talk at them about it, right? And use jargon and use math and like talk about algorithms and redistribution of votes, and talking about it is a little bit difficult. I've been doing this for 7-8 years, and it's not the easiest thing to talk about it, but if you show it and have them do it, you're in.
And I will also send a follow-up email after this session, and I will include the video that Maria shared with us in that email. So feel free, of course, with the permission of Maria, to use that video during your education. Awesome, thank you. All right, next person I see their hand up is Eric Sutton. Please go ahead and unmute.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering what kind of turnouts, voter turnouts, like overall voter turnouts, have you seen on follow-up elections after the first round of voting, if those were required? I'm assuming there's a diminishing return, but is it to the point where you only see like 5% show up, or are you still seeing a significant number of people participating?
You mean with like people who have ranked multiple candidates?
Well, assuming let's say there's a pool of, you end up with a pool of 4 people who move on to a second round of voting. What kind of turnout do you get for that next round?
Right.
Yeah.
That's an excellent question. So that's what's called an exhausted ballot, right? When you're a voter, you filled out your ballot and you either only ranked one candidate, and then if your candidate gets eliminated because they don't have enough popular support, then the tabulators are going to look, okay, this voter, who's their next choice on their ballot? And if there isn't a next choice on their ballot, that ballot becomes exhausted, right? there's very low actually rate of exhausted ballots, and this is, I mean, there's over 50 places that are using ranked choice voting now, so like it changes place to place, but overall the rate of people not showing up for those additional rounds is way less than when you have a top 2 runoff election that happens, say, 4 to 6 weeks after the first election. So when you're actually asking for people to come back, those usually drop tremendously voter turnout. But when you just have people fill in a ballot in one go, that rate of exhausted ballots is quite low. What did you see in Alaska with exhausted ballots, Julie?
You know, and I'm trying to look through, Maria, I mean, the difficulty is that we actually had almost all of our legislative races up, so it's hard to see a trend over the exhausted ballots. I will say that the majority of our races, we didn't see, and not a lot of there were only a certain number that went to tabulation, and unfortunately our division of elections didn't give us the information for the exhausted ballots for the other rounds. I'm still trying to get some math on that, but we did see that exhausted ballots. I mean, one of the things that I compare it to is some people leave blanks, you know, some people don't vote for a race, and it seems to be fairly commensurate with that, where you have people who, you know, they get to the end and they say, of the last 2 candidates, I don't really have a preference. That's where you'd see that exhaustion. You also see people who choose to sit out a race altogether and don't even do that first ballot. And so we didn't see a huge number of exhausted ballots. Most of the races that went through, you know, it really depended on how many candidates you had. The more candidates you had, kind of the more exhaustion you got. So those higher, more competitive, we saw a lot of people ranking, and we did not see a lot of drop off. Where I think that you had, you know, a few more candidates, so we had a little bit more drop off. But it'd probably be better for me to get that information back to you. It's just with so many races we're having, we just need to get the data a little bit, you know, massaged a little bit better.
Thank you.
I think in Santa Fe that that initial cycle, if I'm remembering the math correctly, I think 97% of the ballots were still in by the 4th round.
We do have some notes in the chat before I turn it over to the next person with their hand up. I see Santa Fe clerk Catherine Clark noted that they saw a significant amount of exhausted ballots in 2021 because they're a Democratic town and one candidate was a Republican, and she does say that you were definitely correct about your note right there. We also have Rick Last saying that he thought the question that was asked previously is asking what is the percentage of voters who return for like a traditional runoff versus people who rank a second choice in a ranked choice voting election.
I think Maria addressed that actually.
Perfect. All right, I'll turn it to Miss Ella Joan.
Thank you, Sila. I'm back with 3 people, 37%, 41%, and 29 ranked choice voting. The 29 is out, as you say, but the ballots cast for that first choice on the 29%er candidate, then those ballots with the second choice go to the first 2, maybe 37 and 41. Is that the way it works? And then they up their percentage.
Right. So if you have a race with 3 candidates, the least popular candidate on first choice votes is eliminated, right? And then those voters who chose that candidate, those voters get their ballot count for their next choice on their ballot. And
For their second. Yeah, for their second. And it doesn't mean that perhaps the highest one wins automatically. It just really depends on the numbers.
Yeah,
Thank
it
you.
depends. And like Julie was saying, right, if you have, let's say that we have a race in a very conservative area, right? And 2 of the candidates are very conservative, and then there's one progressive, right? That before ranked choice voting, those 2 conservatives would have split the vote, and you run the risk that the least favorable candidate in that community, the progressive in that community, would be elected because the two conservatives split the vote, right? So in this case, the progressive would be eliminated, presumably, and then those votes would be redistributed to the other folks.
If I were voting for a progressive as first choice, and I don't want my vote to go to a second choice, I could leave that blank.
Correct. And that's what the Santa Fe clerk was just saying right now, that in Santa Fe, in our last election, we had, I mean, Santa Fe is a very blue city, right? So like we had two progressive leaning candidates and one Republican candidate. And those voters who voted for the Republican candidate just largely didn't rank a second choice because they didn't like any of the candidates. And that's your right as a voter. You decide who you give your vote to and who you don't give your vote to.
Right. And very strategic voting, not to give a vote to someone who might second round go on over. Yeah,
Correct.
I can.
All
So the
right.
strategic way to vote in a ranked choice voting election is mark the candidates you love or like or can live with on your ballot. Leave the candidates you absolutely would rather move out of your city than having that person leading you. Leave those people out of your ballot.
And what I'd like to say when we were going through the education effort is like, you know, voting, just like in the voting that you did last time, you rank your favorite one, you vote for that person, and that's your first choice. And then you look at the remaining candidates and say, if I had to choose one of these three, who would I choose? And you just keep going down until you don't have a preference among. And so if you have a race where, you know, they only like blue candidates or red candidates or you know, whichever, they're not going to continue ranking. They're expressing the preference that of the two candidates left, actually, I don't have a preference. Either one of them would be the same. And so I always just say rank until you run out of preferences. So if you look at the names left, and hopefully your first one wins. And this is something that I want to make sure everybody understands, because we did have a little bit of confusion about the rounds, is that if you vote for the winner, your first choice vote is your vote is never going to move, right? The winners that stay in the race, that first choice vote stays with the candidate as long as the candidate stays in the race. And so there was some confusion about, oh, how do I deal with this? Because what if my favorite one, should I vote for them second? Because what if it goes to the second round? Just remember your vote, your first choice vote will stay with that candidate as long as that candidate is still a contender and is not eliminated.
Awesome. And we do have one more question in the chat, and I think this is one of my favorite questions because it applies locally. Jenny Schneider asks, what do we have to do to get ranked choice voting used in our town? Also, what has to happen to get it passed for statewide offices? And I added Bob in here just in case he had any thoughts as well.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's really something that New Mexico Open Elections is leading on. So the first question, how do we get it passed in our town? It's easy. You go to your city councilors and your mayor and ask them to run a bill and vote for it. So we know it's not always that simple, but for example, I live in Corrales. I know some of the city council members, I know the mayor. I'm going to talk to them in the next couple of weeks about putting it on the agenda. If they pass a bill, it's law, and we have ranked choice voting. Now, at the statewide level, it's a little bit more complex. Since we do not have ballot initiative in New Mexico, like Alaska does, we have to get it past the legislature. That's going to take a lot of education. That's why New Mexico Open Elections is going to be focusing on trying to get 10 or 15 municipalities like Utah to pass ranked choice voting so that more legislators see ranked choice voting working in their district. So we have to get somebody to introduce the bill. We actually worked with one of our board members, Senator Bill Tallman. He introduced a ranked choice voting bill modeled generally after what Alaska is doing this last legislative session. It got a good hearing. It did not pass its first committee. But going forward, we're going to focus on municipalities on one hand, and our statewide initiative is semi-open primaries. We'll talk about that at a future town hall meeting. But that's what has to happen. The legislature has to pass a bill, and we're probably at least a number of sessions away from from seeing that be successful.
However, with Santa Fe and Las Cruces already using ranked choice voting, a large percentage of our voters in our state are already using ranked choice voting in their municipal elections, right? So those voters are already familiar with it. Getting ranked choice voting adopted in Albuquerque would be a huge game changer, because then the vast majority of New Mexico voters would know what ranked choice voting is, would be familiar with it. And I think that would really help sort of like get some other municipalities to come on board. But I think Bob is absolutely right. We're some legislative sessions away from a statewide, because we don't have a ballot initiative process at the state level. But I think we can really speed up that process if we get municipalities adopting it, voters voting on it. And the voters include those legislators, right? Those legislators vote in their municipal elections. And if they know, if they can themselves a ranked ballot and a ranked choice election, that is, I have no doubt that would be helpful.
So a quick follow-up question to that. Let's say I live in Socorro, New Mexico, and I want to encourage my local elected officials to implement ranked choice in Socorro. Where do I begin? Where do I start? Who do I contact? What would those steps look like for someone interested in doing that in their localities?
I mean, the beautiful thing about local government is that your elected representative on that city council does not have a lot of constituents, right? Once we get to like a state level representative or like a federal congressional delegation, like that's a lot of constituents, but your local city council member represents a small number of people. So I would start with calling your local representative in your city council, the person that represents your district, scheduling a conversation with them. Don't go alone. Bring a few friends. That always kind of like has a different impact, and just start talking about it. We would like to see this. Let's have this conversation. We would love to see you support this. What would it take? Let's have a town hall. Let's have a community meeting about this. That's the way to do it. It's not easy to get something passed at the city level, but it is so much easier than to get it passed at the state level, right? So you know these representatives. If you live in a small community, your kids go to school together, you see them at church or whatever it is, leverage those relationships and just have civil conversations with your elected officials at the local level.
Well, I think we have a little bit of more time just to address one last question, and I do have one handy. It's basically asking what do you guys suggest best practices are when we're trying to get more people excited and involved in this reform movement. I know like some people in the chat are asking about why are there only 20 of us and there should be more of us here, and of course there should be, but how do we get more people engaged and interested in supporting efforts such as ranked choice voting?
Does Rick want to answer this?
I'm actually a little slow. I wanted to address the last question about making it happen at the municipal level. What we had to do in Santa Fe is there was a charter review. We had a home rule charter commission, and the charter was by law, had to be reviewed every 10 years with suggestions for amendments. And we took advantage of that process to get the ranked choice on the ballot that year, along with other good government issues. So I don't have a good answer to how to get more people involved, but I do want to point out there are opportunities, and the first thing that people should do if they're looking to get it passed in a municipality is to look at, okay, is there an opportunity coming up where the council's already going to be reviewing laws? So that was one thing I wanted to point out. So on to the next question. Thank you.
And also a lot of municipalities, I don't know if most municipalities, but a lot of municipalities do have that ballot initiative opportunity. So even if it's not through the charter review, if you're in a community that has a ballot initiative process, it's just a matter of gathering signatures, right, in your community, and then it goes to the ballot. So that's another way to go about it if your elected officials are not particularly responsive to you.
And I believe both NMOE and We Are Democracy Rising would be more than happy to assist anybody who is interested in getting the movement started in their localities.
I can't do advocacy, so I'll step back from that.
Or just the education portion. I'm sorry, Maria.
Education part, yes.
Well,
And I think I
also-
know,
Oh, go ahead.
I know we're short on time, but what I will say is that I would say that if you can have some popular mock elections places, that's a good way to get people excited about it. We did a thing where we had Fair Foods, right? So you could do if you want to do an open primary, you could do an open primary in Fair Foods and then do a Fair Food ballot, like something fun. Another great way that we found is we're partnering with some of the civic organizations that do education programs in schools. And, kids will take that stuff home to their parents. So if you can work with, I think that we have kids voting in Fairbanks. I'm not sure if there's chapters everywhere. I think it might be a national organization, but we found that when you bring things home, when kids bring things home, it seems like parents also get involved. So I think if you can have some fun events, we did breweries, we did some other things to just get the splash. A lot of people will hopefully partner because it does give them some, press for their business as well. And then just working through the school programs and being in those library, things that you can be there with kids and teach them how easy it is and how fun it is. It seems to be we brought a lot of parents in that way.
Well, I know we're all at time and I don't want to hold anybody longer than promised. So first of all, everyone who participated, thank you so much for joining today. And thank you so much to our very special speakers for participating, and special thanks to Santa Fe Clerk Clark and Representative Cates for joining us today. And hopefully next session around, we'll have more legislators and more elected officials join and listen in on these calls, because they do need to hear, these datas, these experiences and everything. So thank you all so much. And we hope you have a lovely rest of your evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Education, education, education.